Hey everyone, my name is Genius Geography with George. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. If you're new here, welcome. Today, I voted in every US presidential election. I researched all the candidates and came to a decision. I started it on October 23rd, 2024, and completed it on February 5th, 2025. I'm recording this now on July 31st, 2026, and I hope you enjoy. We are only going to go from 1788 to 2012 because I don't want to include any recent politics. So first we have some info. From 1770 to 1801, I will have lived in Pennsylvania. And then from 1802 to 2012, I will have lived in Ohio. This is because before 1802, Ohio was not a state. Also, this coloring is very important. Green means I did not vote for the person, but they were elected president. Blue means I did vote for the person, but they were not elected president. Cyan means I voted for that person and they were elected president. And red means I did not vote in the election, which will only happen once. So let's get into it. First, we have 1788 to 1789. There were a lot of candidates. There were John Adams, George Washington, John Jay, John Rutledge, John Hancock, Samuel Huntington, Benjamin Lincoln, and George Clinton. I, of course, voted for George Washington, and he was obviously elected to become the first president. He was well known. He was a great military leader. Those are the reasons why I voted for him. Now, later on in the project, we will have why I didn't vote for other candidates. But since there are 8 candidates here, 7 of which I did not vote for, it would be kind of excessive to say why I didn't vote for all 7 candidates that I didn't vote for. Moving on to 1792, there's a much smaller list with 3 people. I voted for George Washington again, for the same reason as before, but also the added reason of we already have a taste of his leadership. We already know what his term as president would be like. He did not run for re-election again, however, instead stepping down, meaning it gave opportunity for a lot more candidates to run. John Adams, Thomas Pinckney, Oliver Ellsworth, John Jay, James Iredell, Samuel Johnston, Charles Pinckney, Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr, Samuel Adams, and George Clinton. John Adams was, of course, elected president, becoming the 2nd president of the United States, but I voted for Aaron Burr. What? Aaron Burr? He was a traitor, and he killed Hamilton. Well, he was found not guilty of treason, meaning he was not a traitor, and while he did kill Hamilton, I am only taking into account things that happened before or during the election, not what happened after. I voted for Aaron Burr because he wanted to abolish slavery, and he advocated for women's rights. Moving on to the election of 1800, we have John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr, and Charles Pinckney. But Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr were the main 2 candidates. Thomas Jefferson, of course, won, becoming the 3rd president, but I voted for Aaron Burr for the same reasons. Aaron Burr did become vice president because at this point, whoever got the 2nd most votes became president, which caused a big issue. So Thomas Jefferson changed it in mid-1804, and moving on to 1804, we see that it was changed quite a bit. As you can see, we now have a VP section. For the elections of 1804, 1808, and 1812, technically you could only vote for 1 ticket, president and vice president. However, it was very different to how it is now. Nowadays, you see something like, for example, Thomas Jefferson / George Clinton, since that was his running mate. However, during these 3 elections, you were actually able to modify the list. So, for example, if you saw Thomas Jefferson and George Clinton, you could scratch out George Clinton and instead write Rufus King, which is exactly what I did. I voted for Thomas Jefferson because he supported creating local militias, allowing states to defend themselves. And I voted for Rufus King as vice president because he supported abolishing slavery in new states, including Ohio, which, as you can see based on the info section, is where I lived at this time. Moving on to 1808, Thomas Jefferson did not run for re-election, and instead James Madison ran. And this is really where the scratching things out ramped up, because while James Madison's running mate was George Clinton, many people in the Democratic-Republican Party wanted George Clinton to be the nominee and James Madison to be the vice president. So many people did scratch out James Madison, write George Clinton, then scratch out George Clinton as vice president, and write James Madison. Instead, I just scratched out George Clinton and wrote John Quincy Adams, as in my opinion he was the best of the vice presidential picks. And I voted for James Madison and John Quincy Adams because they both opposed slavery. 1812, James Madison still became the president. It does appear I forgot to highlight in green who got elected vice president, but that was Elbridge Gerry. Now, I voted for DeWitt Clinton because he supported abolishing slavery and he supported free education for all. And that's very important to me. And for vice president, I did not vote for Elbridge Gerry. I instead voted for William Davie, who founded the first public university in the United States of America. That was the University of North Carolina, and he supported public education. As you can see, this election for me was very focused on education, so I did scratch out James Madison and instead wrote DeWitt Clinton and scratched out Elbridge Gerry and wrote William Davie. Now this is where that ends, because moving on we have 1816. This is where tickets were more unified. You couldn't scratch out someone anymore, because that was quite complicated, especially with the growing population of the United States. So during this election, I voted for James Monroe and Daniel Tompkins, because James Monroe supported abolishing slavery, although it was over a long period of time, which I didn't like. But his vice president, Daniel Tompkins, supported the less fortunate, supported ending the death penalty, and supported ending whippings, which is very good because all that stuff is not good. So, in 1820, it's very interesting, James Monroe and Daniel Tompkins, that was the only ticket that ran. So obviously I voted for them because they were the only candidate. Now in 1804 is where we start having reasons I didn't vote for other people. 1824, I voted for Henry Clay and Nathan Sanford. Neither of these people are great. This was a very tricky election for me, but I voted for them because they supported abolishing slavery, although it was over a long period of time. I did not vote for other people, and this was actually interesting. Both Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson chose John Calhoun as their running mate, but Jackson and Calhoun both supported the removal of Native people and supported slavery, which is not cool, and I could have voted for John Quincy Adams, but he also had Calhoun as his vice president. 1824, it was just Andrew Jackson and John Calhoun versus John Quincy Adams and Richard Rush. I voted for John Quincy Adams and Richard Rush because they were anti-slavery. Meanwhile, I did not vote for Jackson and Calhoun for the same reason as before. Moving on to 1832. Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren versus Henry Clay and John Sargent. Also, William Wirt and Amos Ellmaker were in that election, but they weren't that well known. Henry Clay and John Sargent are who I voted for the same reasons as before. They supported abolishing slavery over a long period of time. I I did not vote for Jackson and Van Buren because they supported the removal of Native people and supported slavery. The same thing as before. And in now 1836, I actually voted for Martin Van Buren and Richard Johnson, as they were running against William Henry Harrison and Francis Granger, as well as Hugh White and John Tyler. I voted for Martin Van Buren because, surprisingly, he was anti-slavery, even though he ran as vice president under Andrew Jackson, who was heavily pro-slavery. But I did vote for Martin Van Buren. I didn't vote for Hugh White and John Tyler because they supported slavery, and obviously I didn't vote for William Henry Harrison and Francis Granger because they wanted to remove Native Americans, and they were pro-slavery, very similar to Andrew Jackson. So then, in 1840, Martin Van Buren ran for re-election. I just realized I haven't been using my mic the whole time. Okay, I think it was recording before, but Martin Van Buren ran for re-election, but he did not win. I voted for him because he was anti-slavery. He didn't actually have a vice presidential candidate, which is interesting. But William Henry Harrison and John Tyler won, but I did not vote for them for the same reasons I didn't vote for them in the last election. 1844, James Polk and George Dallas ran against Henry Clay and Theodore Frelinghuysen. I don't know if I pronounced Theodore Frelinghuysen's last name correctly, but I voted for Henry Clay because he supported abolishing slavery, though it was over a long period of time, which is not cool. But his vice president, Theodore Frelinghuysen, was against removing Native Americans, which is very important, as many of the people in the last elections supported removing Native Americans. I did not vote for James Polk and George Dallas because they were pro-slavery and supported the entire annexation of Mexico. 48, we have Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore versus Lewis Cass versus William Butler versus Martin Van Buren and Charles Adams. Voted for Martin Van Buren and Charles Adams again because they were anti-slavery. Did not vote for Taylor and Fillmore because they believed the president should have no role at all in making laws. They thought, just leave it all up to Congress. We don't even need to sign it, which is kind of weird. However, I actually saw Zachary Taylor's tomb, his actual coffin, when I went to Louisville in early July, which you can see in my most recent video. Moving on to 1852, John Hale and George Julian are who I voted for. Meanwhile, Franklin Pierce and William King were elected. Voted for John Hale and George Julian because John Hale was anti-slavery and George Julian was for women's rights. Meanwhile, Franklin Pierce was anti-slavery. That sounds complicated, but basically, he did not like people that were opposed to slavery. It would be bad enough if he supported slavery, but he opposed people who opposed slavery, which is kind of confusing, but it's not good. I'll tell you that much. Next up, 1856, James Buchanan and John Breckinridge. Meanwhile, I voted for John Fremont and William Dayton. Voted for them because they were anti-slavery, and William Dayton opposed the Fugitive Slave Act. Meanwhile, Buchanan and Breckinridge were pro-slavery, and Fillmore and Donaldson signed the Fugitive Slave Act because, as Fillmore was Zachary Taylor's vice president, he became president after Zachary Taylor died halfway through his term, and he signed the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, John Breckinridge was originally anti-slavery, wanting to free slaves and, for some reason, relocate them to Africa, but he then became pro-slavery. But then, 1860, Abraham Lincoln and Hannibal Hamlin voted for them because, obviously, Abraham Lincoln was anti-slavery. He wanted to use the government to provide access to higher education. He was very well known, and Hannibal Hamlin supported black people's rights. Didn't vote for John Breckinridge and Joseph Lane because they were pro-slavery. And they didn't want to just ban it, they wanted to leave the decision up to the states. By the way, this was happening as tensions with the Confederacy were rising. And Stephen Douglas and Herschel Johnson also wanted to leave slavery up to the states. Herschel Johnson was anti-slavery and supported public education, but he was to be the vice president, not the president. Then we've got 1864. We have Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. Abraham Lincoln was anti-slavery, wanted to use the government to provide access to higher education, and was a great leader in the Civil War. Andrew Johnson was not. Andrew Johnson was bad. He was not good. He undid most of what Lincoln did as president. You may be wondering, why did Abraham Lincoln choose him instead of Hannibal Hamlin, who I liked? Well, it's because if it was just one ticket, this was during the Civil War. If it was just one ticket, only Abraham Lincoln and an ally who also opposed slavery, then people in the South or people who supported slavery wouldn't have voted for them. Andrew Johnson was from Tennessee, which is a southern state, and Lincoln knew that if he chose Andrew Johnson, he would have a better chance of winning. That was a bad idea, because then when he was assassinated, Andrew Johnson undid all of that stuff. But their opponent was George McClellan and George Pendleton. George McClellan opposed the 13th Amendment, which was the abolition of slavery, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, allowing people of color to participate in activities without discrimination, and he was a South sympathizer after being a Union general, but Abraham Lincoln fired him because he was doing a horrible job. And when he ran for president, many people thought he would sign a peace deal with the Confederacy so they could continue existing on their own. Then we have Ulysses S. Grant and Schuyler Colfax. Did you know that the S in Ulysses S. Grant didn't stand for anything? His real name was Hiram Ulysses Grant, but he chose his middle name to be used. He was well known, a great general, supported equal rights for all, supported the separation of church and state, and supported granting Native American citizenship. All of these are good. He was also from Ohio. Remember, we are from there. And I actually am from there in real life. I voted for him. I didn't vote for Horatio Seymour because he was pro-slavery. And he also didn't want to be president. Why would you vote for someone who doesn't want to be president? Francis Blair, who was Horatio Seymour's vice presidential pick, was anti-slavery, but he was, of course, meant to be a vice president. 1872, Ulysses Grant runs again with Henry Wilson this time against Horace Greeley and Benjamin Brown. Ulysses Grant, we all covered last election, but we also already know what his leadership would be like. I didn't vote for Horace Greeley because he's less well known. I feel really bad for him because his wife died like a week before the election, and he died like 2 weeks or 3 weeks after the election from literal sadness because his wife died and he lost the presidential election. I feel bad for him, but Ulysses S. Grant all the way. 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes and William Wheeler versus Samuel Tilden and Thomas Hendricks. Voted for Hayes because he's from Ohio. He was a Civil War hero. He believed the president had the duty to protect the American people. He believed in equal rights for all. And his vice president, William Wheeler, was an abolitionist, and he was honest, which nowadays is rare. I didn't vote for Tilden and Hendricks because Hendricks was racist, pro-slavery, and pro-segregation. 1880, James Garfield and Chester Arthur versus Winfield Scott again, and William English. I voted for Garfield because he was from Ohio. That's great. He was a mathematician, an abolitionist, a successful Civil War general, and he supported freedom of religion. He was also the only president ever in American history to have been elected president right after being in the House of Representatives. Never a senator, never a governor, only president to ever do that. Winfield Scott was vain and supported the removal of Native Americans. That's not cool. 1884. Grover Cleveland, Thomas Hendricks versus James Blaine and John Logan. James Blaine was a supporter of Lincoln, wanted to allow South Americans to have rights in the U.S., and his vice president, John Logan, was the first person to vote for the amendment that abolished slavery, the 13th Amendment, and he came from a racist family, but he did change his beliefs, which is awesome. Didn't vote for Grover Cleveland because he was anti-black people's rights, and he had an alleged violent affair with a woman, which is kind of crazy. I didn't actually know about this before researching this project. He met a woman at a dinner, thought she was pretty, forced his way into her bedroom, sexually assaulted her, and later used his political power to take the child that was born from the incident away from her. And his vice president was Thomas Hendricks, which we already established. He was racist, pro-slavery, and pro-segregation. 1888, Benjamin Harrison and Levi Morton versus Grover Cleveland and Alan Thurman for some reason. Benjamin Harrison supported granting Native American citizenship, which is awesome. And obviously Grover Cleveland. We already know why I didn't vote for him, but Alan Thurman disliked Lincoln. 1892, Cleveland was elected again, this time with Adlai Stevenson. This versus Benjamin Harrison and Whitelaw Reid. Voted for Benjamin Harrison and Whitelaw Reid because they supported granting Native American citizenship, and they were anti-slavery, supported providing free education to former slaves, meaning he was the first president to have been elected for 2 non-consecutive terms. And because of this violent affair, both presidents who have served 2 non-consecutive terms have sexually assaulted women. Interesting. Next up, we have William McKinley and Garrett Hobart versus William Bryan and Arthur Sewall. Voted for McKinley because he's from Ohio, supported making it easier to replace gold and silver with dollars, and was witty. And Bryan promoted a dangerous silver policy. 1900, turn of the century. Wow. Second turn of the century in this video. William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt versus William Bryan and Adlai Stevenson. McKinley from Ohio supported making it easier to replace gold and silver with dollars, witty, and we already know what his leadership would be like. And we already know what William Bryan and Adlai Stevenson support and why we don't support them. Alright, next up, 1904. You see the red, and if you don't know what that means, go back to info. It means I didn't vote. But why? Parker was who I would have voted for. He supported making 40 hours a week, maximum hours, and overtime pay required for working more. That's good. But he also did not criticize lynching, which is, if you don't know, it's violently killing people, usually by hanging. And he denied the right to vote for black citizens in the South. Theodore Roosevelt believed the president could do whatever he wanted, unless a law specifically banned it. That's not good at all. And he believed that black people were inferior to white people. Both candidates were bad. I was super close to not voting, which is what I wrote before I ended up not voting. Did not vote in this election. Would have voted third party, but don't include third party things here, unfortunately. 1908, William Taft and James Sherman versus William Bryan and John Kern. Taft did not believe the president could do whatever he wanted, and he did want to continue supporting the Philippines, and he's from Ohio. Meanwhile, Bryan, we already know about him. He ran 3 separate times. Did not get elected, any of them. But William Howard Taft is who we voted for. We voted for him again, with Nicholas Butler this time. For the same reasons. Didn't vote for Roosevelt, same reasons as before, but also didn't vote for Woodrow Wilson and Thomas Marshall. Because they wanted to have less international interaction with other countries, and they wanted to only act if it was morally required, and didn't care if the American people wanted something. 1916 voted for Charles Hughes and Charles Fairbanks. Fun fact, Charles Hughes was actually a Supreme Court justice. He resigned before he ran, and he was later reappointed to the position in, I believe, 1930. But this time as Chief Justice, which makes sense. But yeah, Charles Hughes, the only person who resigned from being a Supreme Court justice to run for president. But he supported the 14th Amendment, giving equal rights to every U.S.-born citizen. He was a great ambassador. He created an agreement between the United States and multiple Latin American countries, and he negotiated a treaty with Germany, by the way. Didn't vote for Wilson for the same reasons. 1920, Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge versus James Cox and Franklin Roosevelt? Very interesting. Franklin Roosevelt first ran as a vice president and didn't even win. But voted for Harding because he was a great speaker. He wanted to return the country to normalcy after Wilson's terms because they were crazy. And he's from Ohio. Meanwhile, James Cox had a bad economy and bad World War I peace treaties. 1924, Calvin Coolidge and Charles Dawes versus John Davis and Charles Bryan. Voted for Coolidge because he was vice president, so we already kind of know what his leadership will be like. Didn't vote for John Davis because he was pro-lynching, but Coolidge never really expressed his beliefs, but he believed in most things that Harding believed in. 1928, voted for Herbert Hoover and Charles Curtis over Al Smith and Joseph Robinson. I know. Herbert Hoover? Wasn't he, bad? No. He was actually one of the greatest secretaries of commerce in American history. Very philanthropic, too. He supported humanitarianism. And he chose Charles Curtis, a Native American, as his running mate. Meaning Charles Curtis was the first Native American vice president. But that's great. So then, didn't vote for Al Smith and Joseph Robinson. Because, no reason, I guess. But had a bunch of reasons for Herbert Hoover. So while there were no reasons why not to vote for Al Smith, there were many more reasons to vote for Herbert Hoover. 1932, this is where we see Franklin Roosevelt's return. I liked Herbert Hoover, I did, but he had the Great Depression. He thought the president should not help with hunger or cold people. And he believed the government should have nothing to do with the economy, apparently, even though he was the Secretary of Commerce. Roosevelt promised prompt and vigorous action, promised a sweeping program to bring recovery to businesses and agriculture in the first 100 days, promised relief to the unemployed in the first 100 days, and promised relief to those in danger of losing farms and homes. In the first 100 days, promised a lot of things in the first 100 days. Did he deliver on all of them? Not necessarily. But I voted for him again in 1936 because we've got Social Security. Pretty good idea, if you ask me. He had the New Deal. He taxed the rich. He had enormous work relief programs for the unemployed. And we already have a taste of his leadership. Didn't vote for Alf Landon because he supported Theodore Roosevelt. By the way, that's Franklin Roosevelt's fourth cousin. And actually, Franklin Roosevelt voted for Theodore Roosevelt, even though he was a lifelong Democrat. He voted for Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican. Before 1901, which is when William McKinley was assassinated, Republicans were anti-slavery, anti-racism, stuff like that. And the Democrats were the slave owners. However, as you can see, Theodore Roosevelt definitely did not think that. Now, these guys were also Republicans. So they were back to normal Republican status. But then Franklin Roosevelt, he was a lifelong Democrat, but he was not racist. And this is where the parties pretty much swapped. The Republicans started following most of the Democratic principles, the formerly Democratic principles, and the Democrats started following most of the formerly Republican principles. So that is why we have suddenly these Democrats are not racist. Meanwhile, the Republicans are more so, as seen in 1904. Now, obviously, the party's beliefs have changed, but they are mostly the same since 1932. Next up, in 1940, Franklin Roosevelt and Henry Wallace. By the way, he's just cycling through vice presidents. We've got John Garner, twice. Then Henry Wallace. Why not? And then 44, Harry Truman. I voted for Franklin Roosevelt for all the same reasons, but also he implemented the good neighbor policy and sent aid to the United Kingdom. But he didn't send the military yet, because why would we involve in a world war that's killing millions of people over in Europe when we're not affected? Didn't vote for Wendell Willkie because he didn't run in the primaries. He just got handed the nomination. 1944, Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman versus Thomas Dewey and John Bricker. Voted for Roosevelt because he finally joined the war. He wanted to create ties with the Soviet Union, which sounds weird, but they're kind of scary to us at this point. They're huge military, big threat to us. So we need to create ties. And he wanted to form the United Nations to stop another world war. However, right now tensions are higher than they have been globally since World War II. Now, great-aimed Harry Truman supported the forming of NATO, supported sending aid to European countries to help them rebuild, and supported sending aid to threatened democratic nations. Meanwhile, didn't vote for Thomas Dewey because he's not FDR. That's not a good reason, but it is a reason. 1948, Harry Truman and Alvin Barkley versus Thomas Dewey and Earl Warren. Harry Truman supported the forming of NATO, supported sending aid to European countries to help them rebuild, and supported sending aid to threatened democratic nations. There is one reason I wouldn't have voted for Truman. He used the atomic bomb, killing many, many innocent people in Japan. But Thomas Dewey didn't care about black votes. Don't know why I didn't include that here, but let's not vote for him. But Adlai Stevenson, I recognize him. This, I believe, is Adlai Stevenson's grandson, Adlai Stevenson II. And he's a Democrat still, but follows the modern terms of Democrat. He was witty, intellectual. His running mate, John Sparkman, was a pacifist. Now, I may be contradicting myself a little here, because earlier I was talking about why are you not sending aid and military to these people when millions of people are dying? Meanwhile, voting for this person because he's a pacifist. Well, I vote for this pacifist because that means we're not going to enter into any pointless wars. However, World War II was not a pointless war. Millions of people were dying, millions of innocent people were dying, and it was for a stupid reason. And specifically, the Holocaust was going on. We did nothing about it for way too long. Meanwhile, Dwight D. Eisenhower and Richard Nixon didn't vote for them because they lied about Truman's censorship. They were shady and dodgy. They recommended pulling U.S. troops out of Korea right before war broke out, and they stretched Stevenson and Sparkman's words. 1956, Dwight D. Eisenhower and Richard Nixon versus Adlai Stevenson and Estes Kefauver. Voted for Adlai Stevenson because witty, intellectual. Voted for Estes Kefauver, kind. Meanwhile, Eisenhower, Truman censorship, shady and dodgy, pulled troops out of Korea before war broke out, stretched words, ordered the CIA to overthrow the Prime Minister of Iran, leading to U.S. dictatorship in the region, subsequently leading to the theocratic dictatorship today. It's a lot. That's why I didn't vote for Eisenhower. But don't worry, because Richard Nixon's running now. But so is John Kennedy. His nephew, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., is kind of a wacko. But voted for Kennedy because he wanted equal rights for all. He was endorsed by MLK Jr. He was optimistic, a great speaker, and charismatic. Meanwhile, Nixon was very racist, supporting Eisenhower's overthrowing of the democratically elected Guatemalan government, which led to the Guatemalan genocide, leaving over 200,000 murdered. And he told lies about Truman. Wow, that's a lot. Then, Kennedy gets shot. He's dead. Johnson's president. He's running for re-election. With Hubert Humphrey voted for him because he was endorsed by MLK Jr. He signed the Civil Rights Act. He wanted to swiftly end the Vietnam War. We already had a taste of his leadership. And his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, supported equal rights for all, supported gun control, supported a nuclear test ban, wanted to provide free food for lower-class families. Barry Goldwater was racist and opposed freedom of religion. What are you doing, bro? Meanwhile, Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew ran against Hubert Humphrey and Edmund Muskie. Nixon was very racist, told lies about Truman. Meanwhile, Spiro Agnew voted for Rockefeller in the primaries. He didn't even vote for Nixon. He voted for Rockefeller. He was the chairman of the Rockefeller for President campaign. So he must not have liked Nixon that much if he is actively running a campaign against him to have Rockefeller be president. And he lied about media bias against Nixon. Hubert Humphrey supported equal rights for all, supported gun control, supported a nuclear test ban, and wanted to provide free food to lower-class families. 72, Nixon again, and Spiro Agnew. Very racist, had the Watergate scandal, and told lies about Truman. You may be saying, what is happening with Watergate? Because didn't that come out after the election? No. The first people who said things about it in June of 72. But I guess people didn't believe them. It only, became mainstream later. Voted for McGovern because he's a World War II veteran, courageous, determined, and honest. Again, very rare today. 1976, Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale versus Gerald Ford and Bob Dole. Jimmy Carter supported the civil rights movement, supported abortion, wanted to end the death penalty, wanted stricter gun laws, supported same-sex marriage, supported equal rights for all, and did not support torturing prisoners. Meanwhile, Gerald Ford served under Nixon, did not tell the truth about Watergate, and pardoned Nixon. 1980, Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale versus Ronald Reagan and George Bush. Voted for Carter for the same reasons. Voted against Reagan because he wanted the abolition of all nuclear weapons. Well, I think getting rid of most of them would be good. We should keep some in store. Opposed free healthcare, believed the minimum wage should not apply to young people, believed in air pollution, supported the death penalty, supported prayer in school, and was anti the Equal Rights Amendment. 84, same things, except we have Walter Mondale running, and Geraldine Ferraro. Supported the nuclear freeze, supported equal rights for all. We already have a taste of his leadership as he was vice president under Carter, and added a reason to reasons why not. Reagan, we already have a bad taste of his leadership. 1988, we have George Bush and Dan Quayle versus Michael Dukakis and Lloyd Benson. Voted for Dukakis. He's a successful governor. He is honest. He has integrity. Voted against Bush because he disliked change. 1992, Bill Clinton and Al Gore versus George Bush and Dan Quayle. Voted for Clinton, supported NAFTA, supported school choice, and his vice president Al Gore supported gun control. Meanwhile, Bush disliked change, promised no new taxes, then had the single largest tax increase in American history. We already have a bad taste of leadership, and he was amazed by barcode scanning technology had been used for decades. And then 1996, we do have Ross Perot in here, in both of these. but he gained less than 20% of the vote both times. And like I said, we're not including third party. We could have, but I chose to stick with Clinton and Al Gore versus Bob Dole and Jack Kemp. Clinton supported NAFTA, supported school choice, had a low crime rate, and had good healthcare policies. Meanwhile, Bob Dole took money from lobbyists, and Jack Kemp was anti-abortion and supported high military spending. 2000, Al Gore and Joe Lieberman versus George Bush and Dick Cheney. Voted for Gore and Lieberman. Al Gore, pro-abortion, pro-same-sex marriage, pro-black people's rights, pro-hate crime law, anti-drug use, pro-after-school programs to stop drug use, pro-hiring more teachers, pro-government paid college, big advocate for climate change and global warming, pro-gun control, pro-immigration, pro-internet. George Bush and Dick Cheney. And this is George Bush Jr., by the way. George W. Bush. That was George H.W. Bush back in 92 and 88 and 84. Inexperienced. Supported drilling for oil. Does not wish to provide amnesty for illegal immigrants. Opposes free healthcare. Anti-gun control. Anti-abortion. Pro-death penalty. Believes that global warming is nature-made. Supported prayer in schools. Anti-LGBTQIA+. Supported nuclear testing. And he ran again against John Kerry and John Edwards. John Kerry supported NAFTA, supported legalizing many illegal immigrants, anti-death penalty, endorsed gun restriction, anti-illegal drugs, pro-choice, pro-gay/lesbian marriage, anti-Iraq war, pro-climate change, proposed a much better healthcare plan than Bush. Meanwhile, Bush, all the same things as before. 2008, we have Barack Obama and Joe Biden versus John McCain and Sarah Palin. Barack Obama promised to take us out of the Great Recession, wanted to move towards cleaner energy, promised an end to the Iraq War, great foreign policy, supported same-sex marriage, and would be the first black president. Meanwhile, John McCain wanted lower taxes for the rich, against public health care, opposed the post-9/11 Veterans Educational Assistance Act, and supported Bush's Iraq policy. And finally, 2012. Obama, same thing as before, but now we have Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan. Wanted to increase military spending, wanted to replace Obamacare, wanted to make healthcare a competitive market, wanted to raise premiums for 60% of all seniors, has no plan for housing, wanted to lower the minimum wage, wanted to use missiles against Iran, supports legalizing the death penalty, likes Justice Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, John Roberts, and Antonin Scalia. Now that is where we end. I will just give you a little glance. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching this all the way through. I've been recording for the last hour, but I do hope you enjoyed this. I know I did. I'm glad I got to finally share this with you guys. I finished it a year and a half ago, but it's done. So thank you for watching. I will see you guys next time. Bye.